Vladimir Putin today essentially announced a military attack by Russia on Europe. Russia is ready to fight against Europe right now if European countries start the war first. Vladimir Putin stated this at a meeting with journalists, threatening Europe with complete destruction in the event of the start of hostilities. Putin threatened that if a war starts, Russia would allegedly capture all of Europe very quickly and there would be no one left to negotiate with. And let me remind you that before the full-scale invasion in 2022, the Russians also invented a story that it was Ukraine preparing to attack the occupied territories of Donbass and Belarus. That's why Putin supposedly decided to strike preemptively. At the same time, Putin today threatened to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea if attacks on his Shadow Fleet tankers do not stop. Putin was also actively talking about what he was told about the West. Well, and all these statements were made right before the Russian dictator's meeting with American Representatives Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who came to discuss the peace plan for Ukraine. But it's telling that the Kremlin also prepared a supposed concession for Witkoff's visit. Russian media reported in the morning that Putin had supposedly cancelled the task of creating a security zone in the border areas of Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv in Ukraine. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and write any detailed comment under it. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pichi News, the link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. I would appreciate any support from you. So, as you know, today, December 2nd negotiations took place in Moscow between Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin. And so the Kremlin dictator made Witkoff wait while he was speaking to journalists. And here, Putin was clearly trying to intimidate his counterpart and scare him. Putin essentially announced a war of Russia against all of Europe and claimed that supposedly Russia would win such a war very quickly. There would be no need to negotiate with anyone. We remember the claim about taking Kiev in 3 days. According to Putin, Russia does not plan to start a war. Well, of course. We already heard from the big-mouthed Russians in February 2022 that they were not going to attack Ukraine and that all the troops were just along the Ukrainian border. It's just an exercise. Putin's entire entourage claimed that it was a lie, and that Europe was slandering Moscow by saying that Putin was preparing for a big war against Ukraine. Now, Putin says that. However, in his opinion, Europe is seeking to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia and is on the side of war. He says that it's Europe that wants and is preparing for war, and that he will simply be forced to strike Europe preemptively. He also accused Brussels of interfering with the administration of President Donald Trump in achieving a peaceful settlement in Ukraine by making proposals that are unacceptable to Russia. At the same time, Putin added that it was Europe, specifically Europe, that refused any negotiations. And here, excuse me, I'll quote the mad dictator Putin. Sorry, but I have to show you his face.
We are not going to fight with Europe, I've already said this 100 times. But if Europe suddenly wants to fight and starts, we are ready right now.
Not here.
There can be no doubt about it. The only question is, if Europe suddenly starts a war, I think it will happen very quickly. This is not Ukraine. With Ukraine, we are acting in a surgical way. Be careful. I see, yes. This is not a war in the direct modern sense of the word. If Europe suddenly decides to start its own war and does so, then it's very possible, it could very quickly happen, that we will have no one left to negotiate with.
Putin's statement came amid rising concerns in Europe over a possible military conflict with Russia. On November 17, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius stated that the Russian army could restore its potential to attack NATO countries as early as 2028. And according to Pistorius, some experts believe that Europe has just had its last peaceful summer. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte warned in June that Russia could start a large-scale war in Europe within 5 years. In February, Danish intelligence gave a similar assessment. French General Staff Chief Fabien Mondon said in October that preparations are needed for a confrontation within the next 3 years. The head of Germany's Joint Operational Command, Lieutenant General Alexander Zollfrank, pointed out that Moscow's decision to invade Europe would depend on Russia's military power and the possible reaction of the West. The head of German intelligence warned last summer about the risk of a Russian provocation in the Baltic states following the scenario of the annexation of Crimea. The chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces, General Wisław Kukulov, stated in mid-November that his country is in a pre-war state. And Europe, let's not hide it, is clearly preparing for war. Well, because the neighbors are the way they are, wild Russians. And as they say, how can you not prepare when the bold dictator is already openly threatening such a war? Today he openly, remember this day today, Putin openly declared that he is announcing a war against Europe. Ukrainians have been through all of this. We went through it in 2014 and in all the following years, especially in 2022. These messages are clearly understood. Russians, they're not brave enough to say, we're going to war. No. They look for these kinds of phrases like, well, if Europe attacks first, then we're definitely ready to fight, we're ready for war, and so on. We've all heard this, and I predict that uneducated, absolutely Russian people will come to comment under this video. Who will be writing that Putin said he would attack Europe if they start first? Like, it would be Moscow's response. So, let me remind you that the formal reason for the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Putin called Ukraine's preparation to attack the occupied Donbass, which he had recognized as supposedly independent republics just a couple of days earlier. Putin claimed Ukraine planned to attack the Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic first, so he said he would strike preemptively. When the Russians captured the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the first days of the full-scale war, Putin claimed that Ukraine was supposedly preparing some kind of nuclear provocation there. And that's why the Russians acted preemptively to prevent this nuclear provocation, and so on. And that's how it is with everything. Basically, the Kremlin always comes up with false pretexts for war. So it's no surprise that when Moscow attacks Europe, the unwashed Russians will be told that they simply carried out a preemptive strike. Well, everyone remembers that meme when Lukashenko was talking about the 4 directions, saying that if they hadn't attacked, Ukraine would have attacked them. But Putin's threats didn't end there. Russia can make it so that Ukraine loses access to the sea, Putin said. He said this to journalists while commenting on the strikes that took place last week and this week on tankers linked to Russia, which also transport oil from Russian ports in the Black Sea. Here is a quote from Putin. We will consider the possibility of retaliatory measures against ships from those countries that help Ukraine carry out these operations. Pirate actions. The most radical way is to cut Ukraine off from the sea, then it will be impossible to engage in piracy at all, in principle. Well, there you have it, a pretext for attacking Europe. Putin is openly saying that he is considering actions against those who help Ukraine. Putin stated that the Ukrainian army is responsible for the explosions on tankers carrying Russian cargo. And once again calling it piracy, he threatened Kyiv with intensified attacks on civilian infrastructure. Look how amusing this is, the hypocrisy of Russians. They're extremely two-faced. Putin calls the attacks on tankers and the Shadow Fleet in the Black Sea piracy. And right away, Putin warns that if attacks on tankers connected to the Shadow Fleet of the Russian Federation continue, Moscow will consider taking action against foreign vessels. In other words, Putin is saying, we will do exactly the same thing. We will attack vessels of other countries. But don't get it wrong, this won't be piracy. However, Ukraine, by striking shadow tankers, that's piracy. If we strike, it's not piracy. And all these statements and threats from Putin, they were being made while Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, were sitting in the hallway waiting for a meeting with the dictator. And such brazen behavior by the Russian dictator is their fault. It is the administration of Donald Trump that will bear responsibility before history for emboldening this bold Putin. Because right now, Witkoff is essentially serving Putin's interest by promoting his peace plan for Ukraine. It was Vitkov who whispered in Trump's ear that Putin wants peace. It is Vitkov who is proposing to return Russia's frozen assets in Europe immediately after the war ends. Vitkov suggests that, as a reward for aggression, Donbass should be given to Putin, and so on.
But
We'll talk about all this in more detail in the next episode. In this episode, I'll leave it at that. Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Bye everyone.